Hi guys, welcome back to the Revive Stronger podcast. I'm your host, as always, Steve Hall, and today I'm talking to Josh Pelland for the first time, but not for the last time. He is part of Data Driven Strength alongside Jake and Zach, who have also been on the show, and they're all pursuing their PhD at FAU Muscle Lab under Mike Zourdos, who has also been on the show. These are really smart guys and up and coming within the scientific field and doing a great job of communicating science. And that's why he's on today, because we delve into some really interesting subjects where he had some content that I just wanted to dive into even more that hasn't been covered on the podcast much before. We dig into actually initially just kind of what led Josh to where he is in terms of pursuing his PhD, what his current interests are in terms of his training, moving away from powerlifting into bodybuilding, and then also what was the most surprising part of conducting research that he didn't necessarily expect. I think there was actually a really interesting answer that he provided there. And then we delve into advanced training techniques. What exactly are those? Should they be put up on a pedestal? Do they provide better gains, equal gains? And particularly this advanced training technique where there's digital resistance that slowly reduces the load as we fatigue. This is on a tonal device and it has this burnout mode. And we dig into whether or not that is the creme de la creme for hypertrophy. I think you guys are going to really enjoy this. Before we dive into the show, as a small reminder, at Revive Stronger, coaching is what we do. We coach people online, but do it in a really personalized way. We have video check-ins on a weekly basis so we can communicate really freely and really well, and our clients can ask us any questions so we can educate them alongside getting them jacked, shredded to stage, whatever their goal might be, hypertrophy related, fat loss related, and obviously just making them a healthier and overall better human. This is what we do at Revive Stronger. We coach people to that. So if you are interested in leveling up your physique, leveling up your knowledge, then definitely check out our online coaching. But without further ado, let's get into the chat with Josh. Hi guys, welcome back to the Revive Stronger podcast. I'm your host, as always, Steve Hall, and today I have Josh Pelland on the show. I think many of the listeners will be aware of who Josh is, and if you're not, well, enjoy, because he's a very smart individual, and I'm excited to talk to him today. He is the co-owner of Data Driven Strength. If you're not aware of who they are, you might very well be aware of Jake and Zach, who are also part of the team. They've both been on the podcast before. So now you're getting acquainted with Josh as well. And it's good to have many of those guys on because they're doing fantastic work. He's also pursuing his PhD at the FAU Muscle Lab with Mike Zourdos. So comes highly recommended from Mike Zourdos, who if Mike's recommending people, then that makes me feel very good about bringing that individual on the show. So yeah, first things first, I guess. Actually, I don't know why this was my first question, but I'm going to start with it because I've just read it. Josh, what do you personally train for? Because I actually don't know if I know that question answer.
Yeah, man. Well, first and foremost, thanks for having me on. Been a listener of the show for a while, so it's an honor to be on. To answer your question, it's actually changed recently. I really got into training, well, originally for sports performance, and that's kind of when that's kind of how I started as a practitioner as well, is in a private S&C setting for high school and collegiate athletes. But then once I was, hung up the basketball shoes for good, I was initially kind of enamored by strength training, and that's kind of been the focus, I'd say, up until maybe 6 to 8 months ago. So I've done a handful of powerlifting meets. I'm a very average at best powerlifter, but I very much enjoy it from a kind of a theoretical perspective and kind of from a problem solving and intellectual perspective. We at Data Driven Strength, most of our clients are also kind of in that powerlifting strength realm. So that's been my kind of focus up until I'd say about 6 to 8 months ago, because I kind of came to a realization that time is limited, and it was difficult to pursue strength training. And also I've always kind of cared about hypertrophy training and physique development. And I realized that something probably had to give, just given demands of responsibilities at the university, chipping away at the PhD, my role within Data Driven Strength. So anyway, I've completely flipped the script on that. Completely flipped the script on that. And it's been completely hypertrophy training probably for about 6 months now. And My body feels really good. I've surprisingly experienced more muscle growth or at least subjectively, I think there's a handful of signs that I'm experiencing more muscle growth in the prime movers of squat, bench, deadlift than I did for powerlifting training. So like the pecs and the bench press, the quads for the squat, and kind of the glutes and the hamstrings for the deadlift, which is kind of the opposite of what you'd expect. But I'm also tall, and when I step on the platform at a meet, usually the announcer's like, "Oh man, put that rack height up! Like here comes the tallest guy in the room," And I think that height makes the powerlifts not the most efficient and potentially the most effective movements for those muscle groups. So I kind of felt like training that way was kind of beating my head against the wall for hypertrophy, and kind of getting away from those, at least for a good amount of the training volume, has been quite fruitful, but probably a little bit longer of an answer than you were looking for. But it has recently changed.
It's music to my ears, because as we spoke about off air, hypertrophy is literally all I care about, muscle growth, because I'm that vain and don't care about strength at all. So knowing that that's where your focus has been over the last months is exciting to me. And it's also something I experienced as well. Was I just got psychologically fatigued from powerlifting. I did that a long time ago now, and those big lifts I don't think were the best suited for my physique. And of course, you can try and finagle them to be a little bit more hypertrophy specific, like, hey, maybe not a low bar, do like a heel elevated high bar squat or something like this. But you are very tall, because I saw a photo with you and Milo, and Milo's a tall person, and I can't remember if you're actually taller than Milo, but I was like, oh God, Josh is actually a big guy.
I think I'm a little bit taller than him. I'm like 6'3", 6'4", somewhere around there. So I don't know how tall Milo is. Maybe it's like 6'1" or 6'2". He can correct the record if he's listening to this, but I might be a little bit taller than him. So yeah, man, it's a long way down in a back squat.
We'll give you the height. Milo can comment if he's feeling bad about it. And I mean, you feel like giants compared to me. I'm here at 5'10", very average. So anyone 6 foot plus, I'm like, hey, I'm a small guy. But it probably helps for bodybuilding, which isn't a bad thing.
Well, have you seen Mike Zourdos?
Oh, true.
Speaking of short, yeah.
He was built for the power lifts. He was
100%.
So in terms of, so that's where your training is kind of taken you. What got you interested in strictly pursuing your PhD? Kind of what led to that kind of level of, hey, I want to take it as far as PhD level?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I initially got to Ohio State, which is where I did my undergrad, and I wasn't totally sure what I wanted to do. And I actually chose Ohio State because I was like, this is pretty well-rounded in terms of like the different programs they had. Because I didn't know what I wanted to do. I started off in engineering, but then I eventually changed to exercise science, and I volunteered in the lab of Dr. Brian Vogt at Ohio State, which is more of a behavioral medicine for clinical populations sort of laboratory. And that's actually where I met Zach, who you've had on the show. So we met at Ohio State, and he actually picked me up from a Shell gas station right off campus so that he could drive me, because he had a car on campus. I didn't. So he could drive me out to the location where we were working with the research participants. And then I think I mentioned RP or something, and he knew what I meant. And we just got to talking, and we spoke the same language, and we had very similar interests. Just fully on strength and hypertrophy. We were definitely interested in research in the clinical populations. I think we still are interested in that to some degree, but that's ultimately what we got into the field for, is our interest in strength and hypertrophy. And then he came down here to Florida Atlantic to do his master's. I was able to come about a year after, and it's just been an excellent experience. And you realize the research process takes a while, and the deeper you get into it, the greater degree of kind of uncertainty that you feel with all of the kind of recommendations and techniques. And, I just kind of felt like there was unfinished business, if you will. So I was able to have the opportunity to continue with my PhD here at FAU. And it's been a fun journey that still has some time left for sure. But if I can make a small contribution to the field and set things up for future researchers, I would call that a success. So I think that's kind of what drives my interest currently, is just trying to make some sort of contribution to get a little bit closer to the truth, or set other folks up to get us closer to the truth.
I love that, kind of getting us closer to the truth, because that's, I think a lot of people think science is like gives you clear answers, but often it's just developing a further picture of what the truth truly is. So I really like that. And you mentioned RP, Renaissance periodization. Many of the listeners will be aware of them, and Mike Zourdos, of course, who's been on the podcast many times, James Hoffman. Did you have any other kind of, before RP, what was like your foray into, I don't know, the fitness space? Do you have any kind of other things that introduced you into it?
So I'd say a big influence for me, and I think I speak for kind of everyone, we have 4 of us coaches at Data Driven Strength. Mike Zourdos, I think, was a huge influence on all of us, who's obviously more in the powerlifting realm. He kind of thinks about training from a very epistemological perspective, right? In terms of trying to understand what inputs lead to the desired output, right? And I really consumed a lot of his stuff and looked up to him and continue to do so as an intellectual and as a strength coach. So I'd say that was someone that was definitely had a big influence. And then I actually got into exercise science a good amount through my advisor, Mike Zourdos, and mass research review has been going on for, I don't know, 6 or 7 years, something like that. And that kind of, when that started, was also kind of when I started to get more interested in research and trying to interpret it myself. So I remember kind of pulling up on one side of my computer screen, kind of the mass breakdown of a study, and then on the other side of the computer screen, the full text paper myself, and trying to see if I could see how they came to different conclusions and recommendations. And so, perhaps part of kind of I guess a generation that looks up to a lot of the folks that kind of, are regular guests on your podcast, and kind of learned a lot through those folks, and trying to kind of build on a lot of the great work they've done.
I think I had a similar discussion. It may have been with Zach or Jake or both. I think all of you guys had like a similar journey into where you got to with your PhD, and similar kind of influences that got you interested into it as well. And I think I spoke about it, and I was just like, if I was, I don't know, it might be 5-10 years younger, maybe I would have gone the same direction, because I am always in some ways jealous, in some ways not. It's just where you are, right? People now, they have like, people getting into lifting immediately could find evidence-based recommendations and have clear directions of where to go. You think about, to bring up Mike Zourdos again, RP, almost 1 million subscribers over on YouTube. Like, they're having a huge influence on people. So yeah, I can definitely see. I wonder if I was a little bit younger, and I'd kind of, I could have been definitely interested to go down that path too, because it's super exciting. And to have those sort of breakdowns was like, hey, when I was first getting into things, we had like Flex magazine, and so there wasn't really that many resources. We had forums. That was the main thing. Yeah. I think it's, perhaps I'm a little bit biased because, our lab is actively conducting research in this space, but I think it's an exciting time because, I think about, and Steve, I mentioned this to you off air, like we've spent a lot of the last year extracting all of the volume research for an upcoming a project that we're working on. And, you're looking back at papers from the 90s, you're looking at papers from the 2000s, the 2010s, then you also have a few papers from the last couple of years, and you just realize how far things have come from a research methods perspective, from a reporting perspective, from a transparency perspective. Folks more willing to share their data with you, or making it publicly available, which I think just ultimately improves the utility of research overall, right? And let alone, I think more labs doing research directly related to what me and you, Steve, are interested in, right? Maximizing strength, maximizing hypertrophy. So I think it's an exciting time. I know we have some exciting projects at various stages in the research process, whether it's ongoing data collection, just finished it, writing it up, that sort of thing. And then there's a lot of other labs as well. So yeah, I think it's an exciting time for sure. Absolutely. Yeah, I love the work that you guys are doing. And out of interest, how much time, if you can put a percentage to it, do you spend like pursuing your PhD versus like, I'm guessing you split between that and coaching are like the main things that you're spending your time on?
That's a good question. And my answer is that it varies a ton. Because if you have let's say a 10-week training study, that typically coincides with the research semester. And we also have teaching responsibilities. So I teach a class in the exercise science program called neurophysiology. So that takes a good amount of time as well. So there are definitely weeks where it's 90% research / university responsibilities, 10%, or not 10%, right? Because there always kind of has to be an amount of time spent on making sure clients are taken care of. But, you know, you kind of do, some weeks are definitely doing the kind of the maintenance on the business and coaching side. And then there are other weeks, you know, I mentioned you, Steve, we just finished data collection for the semester, and I'm able to kind of, okay, it's effectively just about winter break here from a university perspective. Now I can spend a little bit more time on kind of the business side of things.
I can totally see that. That makes a lot of sense. And after you've kind of got your PhD, is the ambition to grow data-driven strength and be kind of full-time online coaching? Have you thought that far ahead, or is it, I don't know if that's something you thought about?
Oh, it definitely is. And that is the plan. As of now, things are going well. Very, very fortunate, I think, to be in the position that we are, and to have the support of you know, our lab and kind of, you know, when I went through the process for applying for different PhD programs and traveling around to interview with them and kind of check them out, that sort of thing, I was fortunate enough to have a handful of opportunities, but I really valued the kind of support that Florida Atlantic offered me in terms of saying that, like, hey, you don't just have to become an academic, right? There are kind of other paths that are up to you, right? And we support you either way. So yeah, that's the plan as of now.
Awesome. Yeah, I love hearing that. And my final question about that is just something I thought of randomly that I thought might be interesting for people to hear about. You mentioned conducting research. Is there anything, or what was the most surprising part to you when you started conducting research? What did you go into it thinking, I didn't expect this?
That's a good question. I don't know if this is as specific of an answer as what you're looking for, but I just think when you get the subject in the testing room and you have to make the marks on the individual in terms of where exactly the ultrasound probe is going to be located. You put the gel on the probe, and you realize how many small details go into it and how much that matters and how much just inherent variability there is in research in general. And that's actually a project that we're about 3/4 of the way through right now, is better quantifying and conceptualizing how to actually make determinations on an individual level. Because that's something I used to do from a research perspective, is look at the individual data points and make strong conclusions about, like, oh, this person gained 10%, this person lost 2%, this person gained 4%. Whereas when you put the gel in the ultrasound probe, and you just kind of realize that, hey, the reason that we do research on more than one person is because of all this variability and all this noise in the system. So, and again, I mentioned this too off air, is I'd say the kind of the biggest thing is you get more and more deep into research is you just kind of open the door for more possibilities and essentially layer more and more uncertainty on kind of your opinions, and you hold things loosely. But obviously, you know, decisions still have to be made. So you can't necessarily fully fence it in terms of your position on things, but always having openness to kind of possibilities, and, you know, even some of the basic things in terms of what we're measuring, what it can tell us, et cetera, I think are things that I didn't expect to be thinking this much about at this point in my research career, but are definitely on my mind on a regular basis.
I think that speaks really well to someone who does research versus someone who digests it. Like, when I'm reading a paper, I don't understand as clearly as what you will the differences in like methodological differences or the way they measure things or even statistics. Whereas like when you're a researcher, you're conducting your own research, like you're picking the specific ones that you want because you think they're probably the most reliable or valid or what have you. Whereas like a layperson will potentially just read the paper and you like flick through the methods because you're like, hey, like I don't understand some of this terminology or like whatever they're using here, and you can quickly go to the results, the discussion, and then you're kind of relying upon the person or the people who have conducted that research and their conclusions. And then you find, I don't know, there's a Menno Henselmans who reads it and he's like, I don't agree with the author's conclusions there. So I think you speak really well to those kind of nuances that I don't know if everyone kind of respects with science. Yeah. And I think, again, it comes back to that science doesn't like give you the answer, it just directs you. Mm-hmm. And it's a little bit more complex than maybe some people think.
Yeah, and I don't necessarily point that out to gatekeep. Like I think different perspectives from folks that are conducting research themselves, that have conducted research, or that have never been in the lab before. I think all those perspectives in terms of looking at manuscripts are valuable, because I also might just kind of have a glass half empty sort of perspective at times when in fact, hey, this is something pretty cool, but then maybe I almost overvalue the limitations at times. So I think that's why I think, shows like what you have going here and just general discourse is such a vital part of the research process as well, of getting those different perspectives. Because, just because someone has done research doesn't inherently mean that their perspective is more valuable on the methods or the results of a paper.
Sure. Yeah, this also reminds me, I can't remember who said it, but something along the lines of, hey, meta-analyses are one of the like most evidence-based like things that we can use, but they're only as good as the studies that are in it. And you could have one single study in there that is way better controlled or conducted, whatever, more ecologically valid than everything else, but it gets in the wash because every other study like points in another direction. But again, if you're kind of just that person, it's like, yeah, meta-analyses, because that's the best thing, and you don't recognize that, you can quickly lead yourself potentially to false conclusions. So it's not fun that it's more challenging and nuanced and difficult and it's not as black and white, but in some ways it is. And I appreciate people like yourself who are good science communicators and like not dogmatic, and you don't really have like, you're not looking for answers, or you're not looking to study things and give you a specific answer. You're just looking for the route to the destination, basically. You're not looking for something to confirm your bias.
Yeah, just looking for clues, and we'll always kind of be chasing our tail in terms of things we think we know, and putting them to the test in the lab, and hopefully we're a little bit more right than wrong over time. But that's what I think just makes it exciting too, is the field of exercise science, specifically strength and hypertrophy research, is relatively young, and there's a lot more work to do.
For sure. And something we're going to be talking about today was actually based off a YouTube video that you did and some kind of social media, Instagram content. It was talking about advanced techniques. And this is something that so many of the listeners will be aware of, things like drop sets, probably myo reps, like basically short rest periods. As we were talking off air, a lot of these things are just leading into short rest periods or different ways of doing that, rest pause, these sort of techniques, intensifiers. And I'd love, first of all, before we dig into it, if you have a definition for advanced training techniques. If you don't, it's fine, but I'd like to know if you have one.
Yeah, the way that I think about it, and this might be a bit of an oversimplification, but it's effectively anything that's not traditional straight set training is kind of the way that I think about it. I find the most interesting kind of the techniques that leverage intraset fatigue, or just kind of the acute fatigue that you're feeling, to get to quote unquote more effective reps and accumulate those a little bit easier. So things like rest pause training, drop set training, or short rest training. There are, of course, a lot of other advanced techniques. There's some might consider blood flow restriction as an advanced technique. Some might consider interset stretching. Some might consider like eccentric overload type training. Some might consider eccentric only type training as an advanced technique. And I'm sure that I'm missing some, but yeah, perhaps a loose definition is just really anything that's not traditional straight set resistance training with sufficient rest and kind of a constant external load.
That is actually a really clean way of thinking about it. anything that isn't just like traditional straight sets. I had a definition. It was from a paper that was, and I don't know if this is the most up to date, but it was resistance training recommendations to maximize muscle hypertrophy in an athletic population, position stand of the IUSCA. I'm sure you'll have seen that at some point. It's from 2021. And they essentially said specialized techniques in RT resistance training that are intended to enhance hypertrophic adaptations by exaggerating the mechanisms by which muscle growth occurs. But I actually prefer your definition that it's essentially anything that's hypertrophy specific, but not a straight set. I think it's a bit clearer.
Yeah, emphasis. I can't remember exactly what you just said, but emphasis on like designed to emphasize those mechanisms, right? Because you got to actually put those to the test, right? And that's why I think if we define it that way, we might lose some folks in terms of assuming that these techniques are inherently better, and I don't even know if I love the term advanced, right? Because it also assumes that more trained folks are going to inherently benefit from these sorts of strategies more than less trained folks. And to my knowledge, there's not any direct evidence to believe that. Now, there might be some practical reasons that's the case, right? They might offer a more time efficient way to get in a given dose of training. And if kind of your dose requirement increases with training age, perhaps these have utility, or perhaps there's a theoretical rationale that kind of changing the hypertrophic stimulus over time, using something like an advanced training technique, could kind of spurt growth, if you will, for an advanced technique. But that's not necessarily evidence-based. I'm not going to say it's inherently wrong, but it's not necessarily evidence-based. The research on periodization in general, which periodization is also a very general term, which is effectively just kind of a systematic manipulation of training variables over time. The research on periodization for hypertrophy is also not very promising, but there's also a lot that hasn't been investigated. So yeah, even with that advanced training techniques kind of term, I think it should also kind of add a layer of caution to that as well.
I like that, because I'm the same way when I hear of it. And I know this from, I don't know if you're the same way, Josh, but when I heard about advanced training techniques, I was just like, I don't know, 2 years in, and I'm like, these are the techniques that are going to build the best gains then, because they're advanced, they're more complex, they're like going to bring more stimulus, more growth. Whereas actually it's just like, that term doesn't mean that. Maybe, and like you said, you could justify that they are more suited to the advanced individual, but it's definitely not a definite for that. But it's interesting, in that paper that I said, they had a survey recently of bodybuilders. 83% of bodybuilders frequently use advanced training techniques. So it's like a majority of the listeners have probably tried something, I imagine, and certainly they'll have heard of them. So like they're used a lot, considering how little research there is on them. But I mean, not that bodybuilders use research very often to dictate their training. That's kind of a niche population that are listening to this, and you and me. So digging into it, you talked about this particular advanced technique. You talked about kind of straight set resistance training uses constant resistance, but this device that you'd have available does something different. So I'd love to hear kind of more about that.
Yeah, so the specific device that you're alluding to is what's called a tonal, and some folks might have seen them in like Super Bowl commercials with LeBron James. It basically just looks like a big iPad, or like a big screen on the wall, and then it has like these lever arms that effectively you can use it just like a cable machine, right? And perhaps we'll start with kind of talking about this through the lens of a tonal, but bring it back to more accessible types of machines. But we have a couple of these devices in our lab, and there's no weight stack, right? There's no external resistance, right? If you're using a cable stack at the gym, you have to adjust the pin, or if it's plate loaded, you have to throw plates onto the cable machine. But in this case, it's all effectively digital resistance. So that opens the door for some interesting techniques. Specifically, they have a mode called burnout mode, which basically what it does is it detects when you fail, right? So if you're doing a set of curls, when you can no longer, finish the concentric of a given rep, it'll notice, okay, the rep has slowed down a lot. or it's completely stopped. I don't know exactly how the algorithm works. And then it'll reduce the load a bit. And then you knock out a few more reps. And then it'll detect when you fail again. And then it'll kind of just continuously do this all the way down to the point where I think it stops when there's like only 5 pounds of resistance left. So it's kind of this like continuous drop set type of approach. And I just think it's cool. I think that technology is very interesting. By no means in that video am I saying that this is something that's required, but I thought it was kind of a cool way to perhaps catch some attention or get someone interested in these sorts of technologies, and then kind of bring it back to traditional drop set training, which we do have a decent bit of research on at this point, and some of the other advanced techniques that ultimately leverage a similar conceptual thing here, which is okay, you can no longer perform or essentially there's a high degree of acute fatigue. How do we kind of allow you to keep going, right? So again, traditional drop set training, rest pause training, or what some folks might refer to as myo reps. And I would also kind of lump in like short rest period training in there as well.
The only other thing I can think that it's similar to is like, you know, when a bro in the gym asks you for a spot and they really mean, can you do some like bicep curls on my bench press so I can keep doing some reps? Basically where you get a workout in, and as they fatigue, you're like assisting them more and more. I guess that's the only way you could kind of, or you might be able to do it on a few different lifts, like on a lat pull down, you can just like press down or something, or self spot. You could kind of do it a little bit if you do a single arm pull down.
Yeah,
not quite as classic, elegant.
the classic forced reps, partner curls, man. And hey, that's maybe something we'll get into. It can be a really fun way to train if you kind of enjoy that pain in a way. And effectively that's what a drop set is, right? Is it's kind of a forced rep, because, you know, Steve, if I'm doing curls and then I fail and you just help me a little bit, you're effectively reducing the external load, right? So it's very similar in concept. It's very, very painful, specifically this burnout mode. It requires a lot of intent as well, because in order for the mode to work properly, you have to move it as fast as you can. And if you kind of like artificially slow down the concentric, it'll think you failed, and then effectively like you're no longer actually doing what it's intending to do. But it is extremely painful by the time you get to just 5 pounds of external resistance. Yeah, I mean, the pump is incredible. It's simultaneously very enjoyable and extremely painful.
Is it similar to, I'm trying to think about this on the fly, because flywheel. So is that a similar concept? Because I know those essentially, it matches kind of the resistance that you're putting into it. I don't know if that's a similar kind of design there.
Yeah, I've actually never used a flywheel myself, but my understanding is that the eccentric loading is based on the amount of force production or acceleration or something going on in the concentric. So I suppose it might be similar, but my understanding is that with flywheel training, it is in a way like indirectly eccentric overload, whereas this necessarily isn't. But there's probably some overlap there as well. And hey, flywheel training can kind of be lumped into these advanced training techniques as well.
For sure. Yeah, and as you alluded to previously, kind of talking about these effective reps, and I guess a better term might be more effective reps, as Zach Robinson's meta-analysis and meta-regression kind of showed, hey, the closer we get to failure, we seem to see a little bit more hypertrophy. So these slow reps, where everyone knows as soon as you're getting close to failure, you have to really grind for some of these concentric reps, depending on the lift, depending on the person to some extent, but they're slower. And so this device that you're using allows you to get a ton of slow reps. So you kind of have a theory of like, hey, is this the way to go then? Is this like the way, like this is the secret to major gains? I'd love to hear you talk about that a bit more.
Yeah, that's a great way to frame it, because if you think about what we know or what we think we know kind of contributes to hypertrophy, it seems that there's kind of like two main things, right? And that's having a sufficient dose of training. And then the second thing is ensuring the quality of that dose. And when I say quality, I think a big part of that is training close to failure. I'd also kind of layer in exercise selection there, ensuring the target muscle is kind of the limiting factor and what's actually experiencing the stimulus near the end of a set. And then that's obviously an oversimplification, but you can achieve, you can check both of those boxes through a lot of different ways, right? You can train with lower reps, maybe in like the 5 to 8 rep range. You can train with higher reps, maybe in the 20 to 30 rep range. And I think rep ranges specifically are a good kind of thought experiment here, or a good way to think about this, because we actually have researched that kind of the velocity at, let's say, 2 reps in reserve, for example, seems to be relatively consistent within an individual, within an exercise, no matter the load. That might not be perfectly true, but that seems generally true. And again, we know that, okay, you can train through a relatively wide rep range and kind of maximize hypertrophy on a per set basis. And we also know that those reps near the end of the set are similarly slow. So I think there is good reason to believe that a slow rep can roughly be thought of as an effective rep for hypertrophy. I kind of cringe saying that a little bit because it is an oversimplification, but I think there is a decent bit of validity to that. So if you take something like this burnout mode, or like just traditional drop sets in the gym, you can just basically stack on additional slow reps, right? So, okay, we just did, let's say before the burnout mode actually kicks in, let's say you do 10 reps. Okay, you effectively got the all of these slow, quote unquote, effective reps from that set of 10. And then it'll just kind of, again, reduce the load slightly, so you can keep chipping away, keep getting more effective reps and more of those slow reps. And again, same thing with drop sets. So if you do curls with the 40s, so you get 10 reps, you drop it down to the 30s immediately, and then maybe you get 5 to 8 reps there, something like that, and you're kind of jumping right into slower reps. So on paper, you might kind of think that these techniques like burnout mode, like drop sets, perhaps like rest pause as well, that just stacking up those slow reps is just going to be this holy grail of not only really effective training, but also really efficient training, right? Because you can do one of those burnout mode sets in probably less than a minute. And hey, I just got more slow reps under the curve, if you will, than if I were to do 4 sets with 3 minutes of rest. But as I'm sure we'll get into, you kind of got to walk that back a little bit and then look at the research we do have in terms of different approaches for leveraging that acute fatigue that effectively artificially slows down the reps.
Yeah, and obviously they haven't got, well, obviously maybe they will in future, but this burnout mode doesn't probably have any research done on it. I imagine you've been using it, so you have some N=1 experience, but I don't know if you've been rigorously testing anything. But we have research looking at like short rest periods, and this is something you referred to where, again, that short rest period means you're going into the next set with fatigue. And so it means you get to those slower reps sooner. What's the research shown about kind of rest periods, longer versus shorter, and what are your thoughts on it?
Yeah, so we kind of started off the show talking about, I guess, philosophy of research to some degree and claims we can make and can't make. I'll start by saying, from a practical perspective, I think I agree with I agree from a practical perspective that longer rest periods are, on balance, going to increase the effectiveness of a given set. However, I do think it's not as much of like a closed case as many people might think. At last count, I believe there's 7 studies that compare shorter rest periods to longer rest periods. And there are 4 of them that are pretty clearly in favor of longer rest periods. And then there are 3 that either show no difference or actually favor shorter rest periods. And then you kind of get into the nitty gritty of some of the studies as well. And you look at like okay, they measured multiple sites, for example. So a very well cited study on rest periods is one from Schoenfeld from 2016, and they measured 4 sites. All 4 of the sites leaned in favor of longer rest periods, but only one of them reached statistical significance. So you could take different perspectives on that and say, like, yeah, like exercise science research is underpowered anyway. That's pretty good evidence. You could take the other perspective that say, like, okay, that could very much just be due to sampling variability or other variability inherent to research. Again, from a practical perspective, I would lean a little bit more towards long rest periods. I think that is probably going to maximize the potency, if you will, of the upcoming set. There's a study from Longo and colleagues from 2020, and I'm always hesitant to kind of put more stock into one study of a given body of literature. But this is a case where, man, it's just a really, really well-designed study. And if I recall correctly, they also measured hypertrophy using MRI, which is arguably kind of the most sensitive method for looking at changes in muscle size. And basically they had 4 conditions, but I'll kind of focus on like 2 of the conditions, because I think it shows a pretty interesting concept. So let's say that I was randomized in this study, and basically there were kind of like 2 arms of the study. And let's say I went into this one arm that I think is more relevant for our discussion here. One of my legs would have been given just straight sets. I believe it was 3 sets to failure with 3 minutes of rest. My other leg would have trained after I do those 3 sets to failure, but I would only use 1 minute of rest. Now, because I'm only using 1 minute of rest, I'm going to see perhaps some meaningful drop-offs in performance for sets 2 and 3. So in that case, we can look back at the logbook and say, okay, you got across those 3 sets, you got 8 less reps. Let's go ahead and kind of do additional sets as needed to make up for that total training volume. And what they found in that study is that sort of approach of doing additional sets with less rest period, with the lower rest period approach, again, recovered some of the downsides from a hypertrophy perspective of short rest periods. So it seems that, again, shorter rest periods are probably a little bit less effective on a per set basis. But that doesn't necessarily mean they're not effective at all. That like a set after a short rest period is not nearly as effective. I will add one pretty strong caveat to that. Not that study specifically, but I would just say the rest period research as a whole. And that is the role of proximity to failure. Anyone that's done like drop sets or short rest period training probably agrees that there's a very high degree of discomfort that accompanies the end of those sets. And what we see in the RAR accuracy research, this is actually what I did my master's thesis on. What we see in the RAR accuracy research is that higher rep training generally decreases the accuracy of RAR sort of ratings. And a lot of these studies will say failure, but I think something that has improved over the last handful of years in research is better failure definitions. And a lot of these studies, I would definitely leave the possibility there that they allowed for volitional failure in the low rest period groups. And depending on the motivation of the subject, or even irrespective of the motivation of the subject, you could have situations where the primary thing driving the lower effectiveness of the short rest period is the fact that they're not truly getting to the same proximity to failure. They're not truly getting to failure like the longer rest period group because of that higher discomfort that comes with these sorts of higher intraset fatigue protocols. So I'll pause there, but I guess just to quickly summarize, longer rest periods probably a better sort of default, but there might be a way to kind of get around it, if you will, by ensuring that you're actually getting close to failure, which easier said than done, and potentially by just doing slightly more work to kind of make up for it.
Do you not see the progress you would like? Are you sick of writing your own programs? Or perhaps you need some accountability in order to stick with a plan? Then it's time to start working with us. We at Revive Stronger offer a truly personalized coaching service. You'll get more than just an email with some macros or random cookie cutter program. With Revive Stronger, you will be the center of our attention. You will receive your own fully individualized training protocol alongside a customized nutritional strategy. We create the coaching around your needs, wants, personal preferences, and your own unique lifestyle. Every single week, we delve into your program in order to make appropriate adjustments so that we get the most out of your time and the best possible outcome. We help both female and male athletes to seriously change their body composition by adding more muscle mass and decreasing fat tissue. No matter if you're a competitive bodybuilder or just want to look better, if you need help with your progress and taking your physique to the next level, our coaching is for you. It's time to make a change. Sign up today and let's revive stronger.
Yeah, I find that really interesting because I think it's something you said actually where you're essentially saying, hey, not all slow reps are created equal. I think you mentioned actually within research, they tend to find, hey, the first sets, and we kind of know this, you get diminishing returns from the more you do. So you're getting more hypertrophy from the earlier sets within like kind of your training there. So the latter ones are just providing you less and less later on. And you kind of theorize it's down to that fatigue. But it's so interesting to think, again, it comes back to something I've been saying probably too much, like many ways to skin a cat, many roads to Rome. Like you've got to find stimulus. And I mean, you could do short rest periods, but you're going to have to do more work, or you could take longer rest periods and maybe it takes the same amount of time in the end. And it's then that, okay, stimulus to fatigue trade-off, like, okay, well, what's this optimization question that is something that we're getting closer to finding the truth, I think.
Yeah, for sure. And I kind of mentioned before, and this goes to your point of there's many ways to skin a cat. I mentioned how I think kind of the two cornerstones of training that leads to good optimal hypertrophy outcomes is having a sufficient dose and ensuring the quality of that dose. And again, a big part of that quality is proximity to failure. I would add almost like a 2B to that. And that is to ensure that there is overload, right? Just the basic principle of progressive overload. And this is kind of a side note, but something I think I'm shifting my perspective on is the time scale at which overload should occur. And I am kind of leaning a little bit more towards ensuring there is progression of certain variables on a week-to-week basis. So kind of a little bit more of like a beating the logbook type of approach. This is probably a whole nother discussion, but part of that stems from the fact that my dissertation research will be kind of in this realm of skeletal muscle resensitization. But anyway,
nice.
There is reason to believe that also using short rest periods or using these sort of advanced training techniques makes it harder to ensure that overload is occurring on a relatively short time scale, because your performance is going to be so sensitive to whatever kind of rest periods that you're using, right? Whereas if you're just doing kind of, auto-regulated, relatively long rest periods, you can just rest as long as you need to perform maximally or at least very close to maximally. Whereas if you take 40 seconds before your myo rep cluster versus 20 seconds before it, that's gonna, or even 40 versus 35, right? That can have a meaningful influence on your ability to kind of beat the logbook, if you will. And I say that with some caution because I don't think you have to do that on a week-to-week basis, but I think that's a good way to kind of plan your training, or a good thing to generally strive for. So again, if, shorter rest periods, drop sets, rest pause, they can definitely contribute to number one of sufficient dose, but they might compromise on 2 and 2B, and 2 being the quality of the training. So actually getting close to failure because of that very high discomfort. And then also 2B, it can make the tracking of training harder to ensure that overload is occurring.
Yeah, I think this is something that powerlifting is really good at, is having structure. And I think a lot of people have taken that, and maybe even some of the periodization elements, maybe a bit far sometimes, potentially. Like you said, we don't have lots of research in it. But you do have those individuals that go to the gym, they don't logbook, they just go into the gym, they burn out, they just reach failure. And I mean, I think for some people that'll work, but you get to a point, at least for me, it's like, if I don't know what I did last time, it's hard to be sure that I'm progressing things sufficiently in future. And it's nice to have some sort of structure, just like technique. Yeah, there's probably a range. You don't have to have like exactly the same like number of seconds per millisecond of like an eccentric, but you want to make sure it's somewhat the same. Otherwise, you could be changing so many things that you don't reality know what's going on. Kind of, you can't manage what you don't measure. And this is kind of what you're talking about here a little bit, where it's like, hey, it's just a bit challenging to get some of the important principles in place for long-term success. And probably why I imagine most people, I guess this is the same for you, Josh, but the majority of my training, I do use some advanced techniques now and then, but it's not like my whole session is like drop sets, which I think is in some of the literature, like it's not that ecologically valid because they do literally a drop set for every single exercise, which I don't think many people do.
Yeah, that's a great point. And that brings up kind of two thoughts in my head. The first is I want to make it clear that I'm not trying to say that short rest period training or drop sets or rest pause don't have a place in hypertrophy training. I'm definitely not saying that by any means. And if anything, I would probably give a little bit more credence to something like shorter rest period type of protocols, given my general perspective on the research. Again, I kind of lean towards longer rest period, but I don't think the nail is in the coffin, if you will. Specifically, I would love to see some more rest period research with very clear failure definitions and on exercises that are more likely to actually achieve failure, right? Total side note, I'll kind of bring this back home, but we just pre-printed a study for squat and bench training. It was a 3 times per week training study. They did squat and bench in all 3 sessions. And this was actually before I got to Florida Atlantic University and started my master's. This study got interrupted by COVID, so it had been going on for a while. But the original plan was to have a failure group that reached momentary failure on every single set of squat and bench press. And that group ended up being discontinued because we're like, this is just not realistic, right? And some of these studies that say failure, and this is not at all a knock on the researchers, especially like some of the older studies. It's like, I just don't think we had the same kind of conceptual framework of training that we have now. But anyway, the point I'm making is that I just, especially on something like a squat, I just don't know if actually true failure is even sustainable in some of these studies, right? Now on leg press or bicep curls or even Smith machine squats, I think it might totally be different. But if you have a strict momentary failure definition, we had 3 participants complete that protocol and we reported that data, and you can find it in the preprint, but it's hard to imagine that sort of strict definition was applied in some of these studies. And again, that's not a knock on the researchers at all, just something to keep in mind. But to kind of bring it back, I don't want to make it seem like there's no place for these sorts of approaches in training. I think they are, like, actually, if you take a step back, you can take another perspective and say, hey, drop set and rest pause training. There's a recent drop set study or drop set meta-analysis from Max Coleman. Basically what you see is no difference when you on balance, when you look at drop set training versus traditional training. And the drop set studies, of course, or the drop set protocols are, of course, using shorter session times. So you could even say it's more efficient. There are, I think, 2 rest pause studies that are probably the most relevant here. There's one by Prestes and colleagues from 2019. They actually found greater growth from rest pause training. I would kind of caveat that because the rest pause group trained very clearly to failure, whereas the traditional group, they did 3 sets of 6 at 80%, so probably not to failure. There was no clear progressive overload strategy. So there's even some research that, again, someone with a different perspective might say like, hey, this is just as effective, maybe even here and there more effective. But I'd probably put a little bit more emphasis on a study from, I believe this was also from Allison Ennis, who published the recent high volume study. And this one was from 2021 or 2022, and they had a traditional group, a rest pause group, and a drop set group. So really cool design to see. They trained squats, leg press, and leg extension. And they saw similar hypertrophy in the three groups. However, and this is an important thing we also see just in the broader drop set research, the rest pause and drop set protocols did more sets. And when I say sets, I would include like after you drop it, you start a new set, or after you do like a mini rest period before kind of a cluster set in a rest pause protocol, I would count that as an additional set. So it was like effectively for each exercise, it was 4 sets of traditional training, and then like 6 sets, if you will, of rest pause, and then also 6 sets of drop set training. So what we see in that NS study, what we see in the short rest period research, or at least some signs of that, and then what we also see in Max Coleman's meta-analysis is that in order for drop set training to kind of get on equal footing as longer rest period traditional training or straight sets, you have to do a little bit more work. Okay, so that's probably like a very solid practical take home, is like these are great ways to train, and they probably have a place. And an optimist or someone with a different perspective might even make the argument that it's generally more efficient. But the kind of number of sets, if you will, kind of has to increase. And that kind of aligns with the general model I mentioned in the video. And that is that not all slow reps are necessarily created equal, because if you do a slow rep under very high fatigue, right? Let's say I started a set with the burnout mode at 30 pounds, and now I'm at 10 pounds. And the velocity is the exact same in those two scenarios. I think the effectiveness of that set with 10 pounds is going to be lower. Doesn't mean it's not there, but it just means I probably have to get more of those sorts of contractions, which also could contribute to fatigue. That's a whole nother discussion. But kind of the take home here is I think that they're certainly effective. You just might have to do a little bit more. Another place that my mind goes is a potential benefit of mixing different training strategies. I think that's a very interesting discussion, but I don't know if that's a rabbit hole you want to go down.
No, I find it really interesting. It makes a lot of sense, because this would be a question you may have even had a client ask you, or have thought about yourself, or you've seen online, is particularly, I think in our space, Myo reps are quite popular, and people will be like, so what do I class? Like how many, each cluster, how many sets does that count as? And very rarely does anyone suggest you count that as a whole effective set. It's normally maybe like half. And I don't know if that's like in line with the literature, but it certainly doesn't count the same as that first straight set. And so I think that's really interesting. The way my head goes, and you said kind of combining things, which I think is a really cool way of conceptualizing it too, because my head goes towards, I think about, because people talk about hard sets, 10 to 20 is like, are you doing for your quads like 10 to 20 sets of just straight up squats or leg press or leg extensions, or you combine them, because one set of leg extensions is not growing your quads as well as one set of leg press. There's a different stimulus there for most individuals. At least that's my personal opinion on it. I don't know if we have I don't know if that's an evidence-based statement to say one set of leg press grows your quads more than one set of leg extensions, but in my experience, that seems to hold true. But there's a different fatigue cost associated with each of those. And it's also, you're training the rec fem in the leg extensions. So it probably makes sense to combine them. So it's kind of like you were talking to about this, like, hey, you could combine straight sets and these advanced training techniques where you are limiting rest periods to hold on to that fatigue, to try and maybe, again, get to this, like, talk about this optimal equation, like somewhere that's a good place to be versus relying on one or the other.
Yeah, this is honestly probably one of the areas I'm most interested in, and it's a very broad kind of question, and that is like, is the combination of training approaches redundant, or can you kind of stack them, right? So like you mentioned, research is designed to kind of get as much clarity as possible at the questions. So I agree, a lot of these studies aren't like super ecologically valid, or it's not the exact sort of training approach you would actually do in the gym, but that's by design, so we can get insight into the general effectiveness of this type of approach. So I think an interesting kind of next step, I kind of say that with some hesitancy, because of course we still have questions in that sort of research, but I think an interesting place for future research to also explore is, again, kind of whether these sorts of approaches can stack. And I think we can also draw on other areas of research here. So you mentioned like combining exercises. We do have direct research that is probably a good thing for kind of like, growing across the entire length of a muscle, for example, or the rectus femoris in the leg extension, or ensuring that all of the heads of the hamstring are trained sufficiently. So I do think that's probably the one that we have the best theoretical and experimental basis for. Another one that I'm particularly interested in, and this will hopefully be pre-printed here relatively soon, led by one of the lab members here at FAU, Seth Hinson, is basically we compared only doing training that is that overloads the kind of the stretch position of the muscle, compared to doing half of your training like that, so overloading the stretch position, and half of the training overloading the shortened position. I can't directly talk about the results yet, but I think that's another interesting area as well of like, hey, can these sorts of different training approaches stack? And then getting into kind of perhaps some areas of research that can give us some insight into like whether drop sets or myo reps or short rest period type protocols can stack with kind of your bread and butter longer rest period straight set training. We unfortunately, to my knowledge, don't have much research on that front, or really I can't think of any. But we do have some research looking at different rep ranges and whether training with basically like, okay, should I do all sets of 10 throughout this entire training week, or should I do 1 day sets of 10 and 1 day sets of 20? And we don't have many studies. I believe we have like 4 or 5. And on our website, we actually did kind of like a meta-analysis of this. And it seems like there's a slight benefit to mixing rep ranges. It was primarily driven by one study, so definitely not a super conclusive finding. But hey, maybe there is reason to believe that, okay, we see this sign in the research comparing constant versus varied rep ranges, that varied rep ranges might have a slight edge. So perhaps doing some rest pause training, some short rest period training, some drop set training does have utility. And the way that I see this from a practical perspective is that there probably isn't a downside, or at least there aren't many downsides, because if anything, they take less time. And if you're smart with the exercise selection, I don't think fatigue is going to be a huge issue. So that the truth is that we don't know, but that's definitely possible. And we do see some hints of different training approaches stacking in the research.
Yeah, I think that makes a ton of sense to me. I really enjoy that thought process. And you already spoke to one of the benefits. This is something you're alluding to here, but also the time efficiency one. So I just think about, I don't know, some muscle groups just take an absolute beating. So sometimes it could be nice to like throw in like a myo match set or a myo rep set or some drop sets at the end, just to kind of like fatigue it out a little bit more, because you're just burnt out, maybe even psychologically from straight sets. I've even found it's nice, talking about periodization, just now and then like layering them in just to kind of like be like, hey, this is a bit different, this is a little bit novel. But I will say the other benefit I have found with some clients is those who struggle to really push the intensity, this sometimes can make them do it, because it's like they have to really, they have to experience more slow reps. So they get a little bit more comfortable with experiencing that. I don't know if you have any other thoughts on those.
Yeah, I agree with that latter point. I've actually found high reps to be quite helpful for that as well. Maybe just people that are a little bit more novice, because you have to experience the acute fatigue in the muscle, right? If you do a set of 25, even if it's not totally to failure because they don't quite have that skill yet, your fatigue, because like your force capacity is lower at the end of a set to 20 of 25, assuming it's close to failure, compared to your force capacity at the end of a set to 8. So kind of just experiencing that acute fatigue, I found is a great, just kind of natural tool to kind of get someone just familiar with that discomfort, familiar with local fatigue, familiar with what it should feel like near the end of a set, with the target muscle being the limiting factor, that sort of thing. So totally agree. But you mentioned 2 other things that I think are interesting threads to pull on. The first is the fatigue aspect. And I also mentioned this to you off air, Steve, is that like we have a good mix of clientele in terms of strength versus hypertrophy, but we definitely lean more on the strength side. And like I mentioned before, a lot of my personal training experience and a lot of the research that our lab has done until the last year and a half or so has been on that strength side. And I think fatigue management is definitely an important principle of programming no matter what. But I think it's especially important for strength training because ultimately the thing that drives or kind of the primary predictor of strength outcomes seems to be the load used during training, and specifically the peak load used during training. And if you're under a very high degree of fatigue, that's going to basically reduce your ability to get exposures to those especially high loads. So I think it's vital for strength training. And the reason I say that, because I know we're kind of focused on hypertrophy here, is I'm not sure that's necessarily the case for hypertrophy. And more of what I look at for my kind of clients that are really focused on hypertrophy, or maybe they're a powerlifter taking a break or very deep in an off season, and that's kind of the main training goal, is I'm more looking for global fatigue things as opposed to specific muscular issues. Drake Easterhot, who's one of our coaches at Data Driven Strength, he's really well read on kind of the overreaching literature and fatigue management type stuff. So I rely on him for a lot of this stuff, but things that I might kind of look for as red flags are like, sleep disruption or disruptive mood or very strong decrease in motivation to train, things like that. But I'm not sure that maximizing my performance on flat dumbbell bench press is going to necessarily maximize the effectiveness of that set, right? So if I optimize things to have no fatigue going into a protocol, no fatigue going into a session, that's going to mean that you're taking something away elsewhere. And based on, some of the dose response relationships we see with training volume and hypertrophy, a seemingly dose response relationship with training volume or with proximity to failure and hypertrophy, that means you're probably going to have to pull back on some of those things. And those studies at the end of the day, if you're in a training group that's training closer to failure, that means you're probably going to be under higher fatigue going into those sessions, right? Or if you're in a training group that does higher volume, you're probably going to be under higher fatigue going into your next session. But we don't see that negatively influences their hypertrophy outcomes, right? So I don't have a super strong stance on this, but I definitely think that the fatigue aspect is quite different when you think about strength training versus hypertrophy training, and that optimizing for minimal fatigue beyond ensuring quality of life is still fine. When considering kind of those global fatigue factors I mentioned is of maximal is of very high importance for hypertrophy only.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. I do think sometimes you can get too focused on, like, again, feeling good all the time and low volumes, high intensities, and it could turn into some sort of powerlifting peaking program if you're like trying to be such low fatigue all the time. And I mean, in the short term, you'll see some great strength progression, but in the long run, probably not the best hypertrophy. And again, maybe not the best strength progression there either. So I think that's a really good point. And you mentioned some of those kind of biofeedback mechanisms or tools that you could ask a client and be like, hey, are we getting near to this like overreaching state, or are we not? Like, how are things going? And it is rare to feel, especially for myself, I train 6 days a week. Like, I'm always pressing on that fatigue, and most days I feel pretty beat up. And there becomes a point where like I deload and I kind of recover that fatigue and come through. And this is something I think I'd be interested in your perspective in. When you're looking at that, are you also looking at, maybe, do you call an objective marker of fatigue if someone's performance is dropping kind of globally? So if like they've dropped reps week on week on multiple muscle groups, is that also a sign you'd be looking at and being like, hey, that's probably not ideal for growth, maybe we need to do something here?
To some degree, yes. But I'd be curious if you've had a different experience with this. I feel like that almost happens later than some of the other kind of red flags, if you will, in terms of like either we need to deload now or we probably should do so soon. Because like, yes, pushing an additional week and adding some more sets or training closer to failure, like I'm definitely all for that a lot of the time. And that might maximize the benefits of that mesocycle, but you're more worried about maximizing the effectiveness of the next 6 months of training on balance, you know? So to me, when I think about hypertrophy, I almost think of performance as like a binary of like, are they generally progressing or are they not? And if they're not, that means that something with the program design should probably be adjusted. Maybe they need a higher dose. Maybe they need different exercise selection. Maybe there's outside variables that are kind of influencing the adaptations that the lifter is experiencing. But what I have also found, and maybe this is kind of my strength bias also clouding things, but people can still perform under very high fatigue for short periods of time. So you'll hear anecdotes of people doing just insane training programs for short periods of time. I think of like daily max training for powerlifting, right? Doing a 1 rep max on bench press every single day for like 30 days. There's actually a case study of that in the research, and that can lead to pretty robust progress over a short period of time. And I think I see some parallels there in terms of the last couple of weeks of a mesocycle. I don't know if I have consistently observed performance decreases being the reason to deload, but instead some of those other signs. But maybe that's just something I need to push folks harder into. I'm not totally sure, but I'm curious if you have a different perspective.
No, I like that, because I think for my clients and myself, when more experienced, those indicators are leading and then performance drops. For clients that I'm less convinced are actually like pushing themselves hard, especially as we talked about off air, like that's this literature coming about proximity to failure, the higher volume being kind of that dose response. I've been a bit more like, for people I'm less convinced, no, like truly what disrupted sleep feels like, truly what being beat up feels like, I'm more pushy to be like, hey, let's just see if you can perform another week. And then sometimes they go into that week and they're just like, oh, my performance dropped off. And I'm like, okay, deload, because now we've got like a bit more of an objective sign. I'm more convinced you are aware of these biofeedback tools. But that's certainly, like I said, it's even for myself. Like I haven't just decided I'm going to deload because I normally deload week 6. Is like, hey, let's actually see if I can continue to perform and maintain a sense of well-being, and like I'm not getting to this overreach state. So I think it is something you kind of have to feel out, and it's quite individual. But I definitely think for people who are more experienced, it can definitely be leading, as you mentioned. Like normally I don't need to see my performance drop off to know I need to back the hell back.
yeah, and that's because you take a very systematic approach, right? And you kind of notice these patterns. And we're kind of getting like more into like putting my coach hat on as opposed to the researcher hat on. It's like, I just think those patterns are what the coach's job is to detect. Ultimately, I think it's absolutely vital for strength, because you want to kind of know what's required to get them to peak performance, because that's ultimately what the sport of powerlifting is, right? And different ways to kind of get to the end point of a block to maximize performance can just vary a lot, right? And then for hypertrophy training, you're effectively trying to, again, check our boxes of a sufficient dose and a very high quality of that dose, and to some degree maximize that over the course of the mesocycle, right? And if you know that, okay, if I keep going and I do the next training week, I know that quality of the dose just isn't going to quite be there because motivation to train is way down. I just feel sluggish. Whatever other kind of biofeedback you choose to use. Okay, let's just cut it right there. Let's just kind of be aware of that pattern that we've seen in the past. And I think it's quite individual as well, in terms of course, the dosage that they can handle, but also the pattern to kind of get to that point. This is a bit of a hard right turn, but I did think it was interesting something you said, like a little bit ago in terms of using things like drop sets or rest pause training at times. And this is something I'm also pretty interested in. And I think it also kind of aligns with being able to like push to very high volumes for a short period of time, for example. And that is that some folks seem to perhaps respond very well to novel training approaches for short periods of time. And do I know that for sure based on the research? No, but I've experienced it enough in practice to take it seriously. So I mentioned we kind of have that meta-analysis on our website of constant rep training compared to varied rep training, and there's a slight benefit to varied repetition ranges. We also looked at traditional training versus BFR plus traditional training, which there's not a ton of research on. But interestingly, I would expect that if there were kind of a combination of training approaches to lead to a benefit for hypertrophy, I would expect that to be the case. But the effect size was basically zero between conditions. So really no clear indication that on average, kind of mixing BFR training and mixing BFR and traditional training versus just traditional training is better. However, there are some hints in kind of individual studies that make me wonder if it should be thought of as more of like a short-term strategy for specific populations or under certain conditions. So there's a study by Anglieri and colleagues. It's from the last couple of years. And it was a pretty elegant design, but I'll kind of just focus on kind of one arm of the study. And within this arm, it was basically a within subjects design. So again, like one side of the body was effectively assigned to a traditional straight set type of training approach with pretty long rest periods. And then the other side of their body was assigned to drop set type training. And on average, again, you didn't necessarily see a difference. However, there was a lot more variability in the response to the drop set training. And again, I mentioned earlier in this episode that I'm not super bought into the idea of looking at individual data points and over extrapolating based on that. But if you see kind of a systematic increase in variability in terms of response to a given training protocol, especially when those same exact individuals also did traditional training, that kind of, gets me a little bit interested. There's also a study from Bjornsson and colleagues. If I recall correctly, they were pretty well-trained powerlifters. So presumably training with very low reps, probably very long rest periods, that sort of thing. And they saw pretty eye-popping hypertrophy of type 1 muscle fibers after just 2 weeks of blood flow restriction training. So again, this is not me saying that like, hey, doing 3-week BFR blocks is the key to unlocking gains, but it does make me wonder if there is something to kind of dropping in these sort of advanced techniques or these techniques that kind of bias the metabolic stress side of things. And I also mentioned when talking about the rest period research that there are a couple studies that lean in favor of short rest periods actually. And one of them, which I would argue is probably the best evidence, because if I recall correctly, they used a direct measure of hypertrophy, which not all of the studies did. But it was in older adults that were untrained. And perhaps due to the fact that they were probably sedentary for perhaps even decades beforehand, I don't think they were obese or overweight, but I believe they were untrained. So perhaps there is something to this kind of novelty effect of these metabolic stress type of protocols. And I kind of see these signs in that older adult rest period study, in that Anglieri study where there was greater variability in the response to drop set training, and in that Bjornsson BFR study. So the way that I see it is, do I have a ton of confidence that that is a principle of training? No. But again, going back to what we've talked about, these advanced strategies seem to be just as good so long as you maybe add 25, 33, or 50% of kind of the sets. And oftentimes that's just as efficient or still more efficient in terms of training time. It probably doesn't hurt to include them here and there, and there might even be a rationale and some signs in the research that could net you more progress over the long term.
Yeah, I really like that thought process, probably partly because it aligns with my own philosophies and the way I've gone about things, in that I kind of talk about layering in things. So I kind of layer them in like a latter mesocycle to kind of, again, it just inserts, whether or not it's just psychological, like people just seem to enjoy it. They're like, oh, cool, there's something a bit different to just straight sets. They get some novelty there. Or maybe, and this is a question I had for you, so you touched on it already, in terms of maybe there is something to that pump cell swelling, particularly if you do something like a BFR. For people who have never tried blood flow restriction training, like, the pump you get from that, the cell swelling, is just like nothing else. It's completely gnarly. And so, yeah, it's something at least fun to try now and then. And it's exactly as you said there, and I'm glad you brought it back up, was like, there doesn't seem to be downsides to using these things now and then, especially if you're bread and butter, you're like, hey, I said you can't manage what you don't measure. The majority of your program is maybe the traditional format anyway. Then just like peppering them in here and there, I think sounds like a really like sound approach. So I think that was really well explained.
Yeah, 100%. Regarding like the cell swelling stuff, or the metabolic stress perhaps being like an independent driver of hypertrophy, we just don't know. The way that I kind of think about this is if you just imagine a very basic figure in your head, you kind of have like the mechanical tension on a given muscle fiber is kind of like one part of the figure. Another part of the figure is metabolic stress or swelling. And then at the bottom of the figure is muscle growth, right? Just to kind of simplify things. We have a high degree of confidence that per fiber mechanical tension has a direct relationship to muscle growth, right? But when we look at metabolic stress, it's not totally clear if metabolic stress simply points to mechanical tension and amplifies that process, or expedites it in the case of blood flow restriction, right? Because you're effectively occluding venous return of a lot of those metabolites, and that interferes with the actual contraction and force production capabilities. So it effectively expedites fatigue in that scenario, which means more muscle fibers more muscle fibers effectively have to get into the game and contribute to force production. So perhaps the metabolic stress is really just permitting mechanical tension, and then ultimately mechanical tension is just driving it. But there's some hints in the research that metabolic stress points directly to muscle growth, but there's kind of like a big question mark around that. And that's just, again, going back to, I think it's an exciting time for strength and hypertrophy research, is that there's more work to be done, and there's so many unknowns, and we didn't even touch on muscle damage specifically there. So
sure,
to be determined. But again, I think this would definitely fall into the category of no big downside. Blood flow restriction training, kind of similar to the burnout mode. It hurts. It's really painful, but it's also really fun, and you have a great pump for an hour or two. So
yeah.
Again, probably a little downside.
For sure. And this actually reminds me of a discussion I had with Brad Schoenfeld, where kind of some people I've seen within the industry have kind of said, hey, yeah, you can grow from a wide range of rep ranges, but they like to just focus on 10 to 15 and discard 15 plus because fatigue and that sort of thing, discomfort, don't know your RAR, that sort of thing. He was like, hey, don't throw out tools in your toolbox. And I think the same thing here. Some people could have listened to you and been like, advanced training techniques, they don't provide you anything above what traditional straight sets seem to, so let's not worry about using them. Or someone might have even listened and they really favor the advanced, so they're like, I'm just going to focus on these. But I don't think that's most people's perspective. But it's like you mentioned here, it's a tool in the toolbox to trial and use now and then. And that's the fun, that's kind of the art of programming, the art of coaching, that sort of thing. What gets buy-in from your clients, because I'm sure some of these, you call it an advanced training technique, your clients are going to enjoy that. So I think you laid out kind of ways in which people can use these and why they maybe work in a really, really systematic and useful way. So great job, Josh. And I'll definitely have to drag you back on. I'll hopefully not have to drag you back on. Hopefully it's just inviting you and you're happy to come back on to talk about some of this research that you're conducting and when the results come out about that, because I think that's going to be very informative. Like you said, it's an exciting time with there's a lot of you guys doing really great work. So it's great to be able to talk to you. So thank you for your time.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. I think I alluded to this earlier, but I think and hopefully this is a small contribution, but obviously we talked about very practical things a good amount. So hopefully helpful for trainees and coaches, that sort of thing. But also I know that listening to previous episodes of yours, it's also very helpful for researchers to kind of get into the mind of other researchers in a non-peer reviewed format, and just to kind of, hey, when the rubber hits the road, what is this researcher doing, or which way are they kind of hedging their bets? And those sorts of conversations I know have been helpful for me in terms of forming my thoughts. I mentioned my dissertation is in the area of skeletal muscle resensitization. And I believe right around when Cody Hahn was finishing his PhD, or had just finished his PhD or whatever, you had him on the podcast and talked about his kind of volume ramping study and some of the sarcoplasmic hypertrophy stuff. And I listened to that episode countless times because I view what I'm doing for my dissertation as kind of maybe not directly building off of it, but quite related, and definitely learned a lot from, of course, his published research, and that's a vital resource. But there are things that don't make it in that published research, getting in his brain, for example, and understanding how that contributes to the overall research process, and that's been very helpful. So hopefully this is a small contribution, and would definitely be a pleasure to come back on in the future with some of the stuff we have coming out here relatively soon.
No, absolutely. I'm absolutely sure it will be. And if people want to keep up to date with you, the stuff that you're doing, where should they head?
Yeah, probably the best place to go is on Instagram. My handle is josh.datadrivenstrength. Click on the link tree and you can check out our stuff. You could subscribe to our YouTube channel, sign up for our newsletter, and then also check out our other coaches at Data Driven Strength. That's Zach.datadrivenstrength, Jake.datadrivenstrength, and Drake.datadrivenstrength. Very lucky to be a part of a great team of individuals.
Fantastic. I'll make sure that's all linked in the description or wherever the notes are for you, wherever you're listening to this. Thank you once again. And guys, we'll talk to you soon. Take care.
Losing weight fast while maintaining muscle mass. Sounds too good to be true, doesn't it? It isn't though. It's reality, and we know how to do it, and we will help you achieve this. The Minicut Movement is an 8-week fat loss program to make you lose a huge chunk of fat while maintaining muscle mass at the same time. We will support you from the beginning to the end so that you see the results you would like to and come out of it much stronger. You'll receive a fully automated spreadsheet that is based on your nutritional needs. You can choose between 6 different male and female training templates. Over 30 videos will guide you through each and every single step of the Minicut so that you're getting the most out of your journey and that you always know what to do. But the best thing is that you can start whenever you want. The Minicut Movement is open 24/7. So if you want to learn more or you're ready to sign up, hit the link in the description below. So let's revive stronger together.